In this book, the author, Michael Sandel, aims to make critical thinkers out of his readers by laying out the most prominent theories of justice in order to answer fundamental questions about fairness and morality. He begins with doing the right thing, wherein he outlines 3 approaches to justice that will each be repeatedly reflected in the theories. Doing the right thing. The author, Michael Sandel, begins this chapter with a brief recap of the price gouging debate that ensued in Florida in the wake of a devastating hurricane. Ultimately, challenging questions concerning the role that ethics plays in the justice system emerged from this debate. Welfare, freedom, and virtue. These challenging questions are essentially centered on justice. The author proposes that there are 3 ways of defining that concept, and those are through maximizing welfare, respecting freedom, and promoting virtue. Those against price gouging laws argue that free, uncontrolled markets not only promote social welfare, but also protect individual freedom. The rebuttal for this is that social welfare is compromised when those at a financial disadvantage are forced into staying in a harmful situation solely because they cannot afford to buy a ticket out of it. It was said that outrage caused by this particular scenario is a type of anger directed at an injustice. The ethical source of that anger can be explained through the virtue argument, which supports the claim that a good society must limit and demonize greed in order to maintain civic virtue. Enforcing price gouging laws may help with that. Unlike arguments about welfare and freedom, the virtue argument presupposes that greed is a bad vice that society should look down on. This questions whether or not the government should have an opinion on virtues and vices, and pass that opinion on through public policies and laws. What wounds deserve the Purple Heart? In considering questions of virtue and honor, another debatable topic surfaces, one concerning the Purple Heart Medal. Advocates for the eligibility of psychologically challenged war veterans for the Purple Heart argue that psychological problems can be just as difficult, if not more, as physical ones. The Pentagon begged to differ when they announced that the medal will be reserved for soldiers who suffered physical injuries or died in action. Within the military, the people's opinions are divided. This reveals that the whole Purple Heart debate is not just about which wounds matter. It's also a show of contrasting ideas about the kind of character and bravery that should hold value in the military, which supports the virtue argument for thinking about justice. However, this is just one case. In most debates about justice nowadays, like in matters concerning the greater good, considerations of welfare and freedom are still more important. Bailout outrage. The financial crisis of 2008-2009 was the author's chosen example for instances wherein the greater economic welfare prevails over common notions of fairness. When reality set in and several financial institutions had to be bailed out, the government had no choice but to use taxpayer money. If that was not enough, news broke that some companies on the receiving end of the government handouts actually used the money as bonuses for their executives. The public protested against this. In the end, thanks to the support from some government officials who passed a bill highly taxing bonuses taken from bailout money, about $500 million in bonuses were taken back. A sense of injustice was the main driving force for the public's outrage. On the surface, this outrage was fueled by the company's greed, giving away money that is not even theirs to their own employees. However, further discussion showed that the deeper reason for the outrage was failure and the lack of remorse for it. The author considered the side of the CEOs of these failed financial companies as well. They believed that they did everything they could have done, and bigger economic forces led to the crisis. This may be why no one appears to be feeling sorry for the whole thing. 3 approaches to justice. A just society should be able to properly distribute goods to its people through one of 3 ways: welfare, freedom, or virtue. Each has its own pros and cons, all of which will be elaborated on in the following chapters. Serving justice by maximizing welfare is the natural, most basic method. Justice as freedom, on the other hand, is supported by theories which give much importance to people's individual rights. Lastly, justice defined through the lens of virtue gives opportunities for exercising moral and religious beliefs, but risks intolerance. Before evaluating these three ideas, the next subchapter will first focus on how moral reasoning can come about through studying two situations. The runaway trolley. This is the first situation, which, unlike the next one, is hypothetical. A driver of a trolley with broken brakes is speeding on the tracks where, up ahead, 5 workers are standing. He has a choice to turn the trolley onto a side track where only 1 worker is standing. The majority would say that it is a lesser tragedy to kill 1 person instead of 5. A slight variation of the trolley situation uses the same principle that killing 1 is worse than killing 5. However, the choice becomes tougher to make because of the more active role that one would have in killing off that 1 person to save the 5. Moral dilemmas may come about from moral principles that are at odds, or having uncertainties about how an event will actually unfold. This is why analyzing a real-life moral dilemma could bear more insights. The Afghan goatherds. The author recounts a Navy SEAL mission in Afghanistan. 4 soldiers went and set up camp near where their target supposedly was. While they were there, 3 unarmed Afghan farmers happened to pass by. They were then confronted with a moral dilemma. The soldiers voted on it. With the deciding vote coming from a man who felt it was wrong to kill men in cold blood, they ended up letting the farmers go. Not long after, they were surrounded by armed enemy fighters who ultimately killed all but 1 of them, including 16 soldiers that came to rescue them. The lone survivor was the one who had the deciding vote, which he is very remorseful for now. Sandel believes that his decision can be attributed to the uncertainty that surrounds what would happen if the farmers were let go. However, if he had known what the outcome of his deciding vote would be, he probably would have made a different decision. Moral dilemmas. Although the situations described above are not likely to happen to most people, they can help with practicing how moral arguments should be formed. Debates centered on morality and justice are commonplace in democratic societies where everyone has their own convictions and the entitlement to fight for them. Seemingly permanent, such beliefs could actually be changed through persuasive arguments. Beginning to reason through tricky topics like the ones tackled so far can be done by reflecting on a different moral question. That process naturally involves stages of confusion and the need to remove it. An ancient Greek narrative proposes that one should go beyond the biases and routine of everyday life in order to discover the true meaning of fundamental concepts. Sandel only partly agrees with this, because he also believes that personal opinions play a big role in moral reflection. Debates, such as those identified earlier, help form and justify people's principles. Those principles require constructive criticism every now and then. That is what this book encourages its readers to do. The Greatest Happiness Principle, Utilitarianism. In a lifeboat out at sea in the late 1800s, 3 men were pushed by desperation into killing a young, dying boy, and later feeding off of his lifeless body. Such a situation requires intensive moral reflection. One's agreement or disagreement with those 3 men's decision reflect 2 ways of thinking about justice. On the one hand, the end justifies the means. On the other, no matter the consequences, there are simply fundamental rights that should never be sacrificed, no matter what the situation is. Jeremy Bentham's Utilitarianism. Jeremy Bentham established utilitarianism, a doctrine that states that in matters concerning morality, the end goal should always be maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Politically speaking, a government could readily apply this doctrine in its law-making process. Bentham himself has proposed projects for political reform, including the Panopticon Project. Rounding up beggars. Another one of Bentham's theoretical projects involved getting beggars off the street and into workhouses, where they were given the chance to work for certain benefits. Every little detail in this project applies the utilitarian principle, even the room assignments within the workhouses. Although this was never actualized, the principle behind it did not die with Bentham. Contemporary applications of utilitarianism could be discussed, but the author has chosen to enumerate the 2 objections toward it first. In considering the potential applications of utilitarianism, 2 objections toward it also come up. Objection 1. Individual rights. In its quest of maximizing pleasure for the greatest number of people, Utilitarianism risks overlooking an individual's rights, as well as conventional ideas of moral decency. The following cases illustrate this point. Throwing Christians to lions. For entertainment purposes, the ancient Romans fed Christians to ravenous lions in the Colosseum. A utilitarian might say that the overall excitement from the crowd outweighs the excruciating pain that a handful of people experience. Is torture ever justified? Sandel ponders on whether or not the use of torture to get information from one person is justifiable, if doing so would save the lives of hundreds. Of course, a utilitarian would say that in theory it is. But this is not to say that all utilitarians support torture, because some actually oppose it for practical reasons. Still, there are those that detest the very principle of torture, arguing that to do it would be to disregard an individual's rights and innate dignity. The City of Happiness. The question of sacrifice is brought up in a story of an imaginary city rich with prosperity and beauty. The catch is that what makes the city perfect is the misery and suffering of one innocent child. The first objection to utilitarianism would agree that the child must be saved, even though it would entail the deterioration of the city. Objection 2. A common currency of value. This second objection to the principle doubts that Bentham's idea can translate every single moral good into a common currency of value, such that it won't lose anything in the process of translation. Studying cost-benefit analysis further explains this objection. The benefits of lung cancer. There was once a tobacco company that generated public outrage by publishing a cost-benefit analysis of the effects of smoking on a country's national budget. Purely utilitarian in nature, the analysis attempted to advertise the benefits that smoking would have for that country's budget, and failed to factor in the value of human life. This strengthens the second objection. Exploding gas tanks. A car company once knowingly produced a new model for cars that had an unsafe engine. Their analysis showed that saving lives and preventing injuries would not be worth the cost of putting in the equipment that would have made the engine safer. A discount for seniors. A cost-benefit analysis of air pollution standards revealed that the cost of human life is lower if the life in question is of a senior citizen's. Utilitarians argue that society is already covertly sacrificing human lives for conveniences, some as simple as shorter commute times. The general public won't admit to making these sacrifices. Those against the Bentham principle state that this is only implicitly done because, deep down, people realize that human life simply cannot be measured. Inversely, its supporters say that it is a social taboo that can soon be overcome. Pain for pay. In the 1930s, social scientist Edward Thorndike tried to put a price on various experiences that brought pain and sacrificed pleasure by conducting a survey. He felt that his findings supported the assumption that everything has a price that landed on a single scale. The author concedes to the preposterousness of Thorndike's findings. St. Anne's girls. The claim that all things can be measured is further questioned in this personal anecdote from Sandel. By the end of it, it is to be asked if the St. Anne's girls' worth equaled the amount the men had to pay for staying the night. John Stuart Mill. Hearing the objections to Bentham's original doctrine, Mill tried to place utilitarianism in a more humane light. The case for liberty. Mill proposes that everyone is free to do whatever he or she pleases as long as no harm would be brought to others in doing so. He argues for basing human rights on utility, saying that respecting an individual's rights, which allows the possibility of rebels and dissenters, maximizes social welfare in the long run. Sandel insists that Mill's moral basis for individual rights is not convincing enough, and that although Mill advertises his work as an extension of Bentham's, it is actually a rejection of it. Higher pleasures. Mill disagrees with Bentham on one other thing. While Bentham believes that all types of pleasures are qualitatively equal, Mill proposes that some pleasures are higher than others, meaning they are stronger and longer when experienced. Mill further explains that between two pleasures, the preferred option is the higher pleasure. Shakespeare versus The Simpsons. The author applied Mill's distinguishing test by asking one of his classes if they prefer Shakespeare's works over an episode from The Simpsons. The results showed that in actuality, people prefer baser, less sophisticated pleasures over classier ones. This poses a threat to Mill's assumption, but he insists that some pleasures really are nobler than others. Even though it is harder to satisfy people with nobler preferences, Mill states that at least their tastes are more dignified. Ultimately, the author concedes that Mill was successful in rendering Bentham's doctrine more humane, albeit through arguments that go beyond the realm of utility. Do we own ourselves? Libertarianism. A utilitarian would agree that radical wealth redistribution is just if it means maximizing the wealth of the less fortunate in a way that doesn't adversely affect the rich. A libertarian would propose that wealth redistribution without the consent of the rich would be unjust, because doing so would violate a fundamental right. Libertarians believe in free markets and oppose regulation from the government. For them, every person has a right to liberty. The minimal state. Libertarians also believe in the minimal state, which is one that only serves to keep the peace, enforce contracts, and prevent thieving of private properties. Hence, libertarians reject certain types of laws, namely those that involve paternalism, virtues, and wealth redistribution. A few notable political and economic personalities, in one way or another, have shown support for libertarian principles. Free market philosophy. Robert Nozick supports the principles put forth by libertarianism and challenges distributive justice. He proposes that among the numerous things that the government should not force its people to do, forcing the rich to help the poor is the most egregious one. By putting basketball legend Wilt Chamberlain in a hypothetical example, Nozick expounds on the absurdity, for him, of wealth redistribution. Michael Jordan's money. Sandel opts to have Michael Jordan in the situation instead in the spirit of keeping up with the times. Now, Nozick's hypothetical situation involves fans paying Jordan directly and voluntarily to see him play. By the end of the game, Jordan earns $31 million, which is more than any other player's salary. In this scenario, it becomes clear why the concept of a pattern distribution of wealth and income is unconvincing. All this is a reflection of the main principle of libertarianism, which is self-ownership. If one owns oneself, then he owns his labor, and in turn, the fruits of that labor. Do we own ourselves? People who support wealth redistribution have objections towards libertarian principles. Objection 1. Taxation is not as bad as forced labor. People who are taxed still have a choice to work less, and therefore pay less taxes. Forced labor offers no such choice. A libertarian would reply that the state should not force anyone to make the choice to work less in the first place. Objection 2. The poor need the money more. To this objection, the libertarian reply is that one's fundamental right to do what he wants with what he owns outweighs the needs of someone else. Objection 3. Michael Jordan doesn't play alone. He therefore owes a debt to those who contribute to his success. Although a libertarian would admit that Jordan would not be successful if he was literally by himself, that person would still argue that Jordan doesn't owe anyone debts. This is because everyone who helped him voluntarily accepted the terms of their compensations. Objection 4. Jordan is not really being taxed without his consent. As a citizen of a democracy, he has a voice in making the tax laws to which he is subject. A libertarian would answer that democratic consent is insufficient, for it gives the majority great control over individual preferences and decisions. Objection 5. Jordan is lucky. Jordan cannot be entitled to the circumstances that led to his success. To this, a libertarian would reply that since the objection also questions whether or not Jordan also owns his talent, what follows is a question of whether or not he owns himself. And if he doesn't, then who does? The principle of self-ownership is appealing, especially for those who place great value on individual rights. But it could be applied in a very extreme sense. Instances include the selling of kidneys, assisted suicide, and consensual cannibalism. Selling kidneys. There are laws against buying and selling organs on the free market in most countries, but if a purely libertarian attitude were applied in this scenario, then such laws should be removed. If people really own themselves, they have the right to do with their bodies as they please. Assisted suicide. Quite straightforwardly, the libertarian argument for assisted suicide is that if people own their lives, they should freely and voluntarily be able to give it up. For some cases of assisted suicide, libertarian and compassionate arguments could overlap. Consensual cannibalism. Bizarrely enough, there has been a real case of consensual cannibalism, which is the most extreme form of assisted suicide. Again, if analyzed through a purely libertarian stance, to ban this would be unjust, just as much as taxing people like Michael Jordan. Hired help. Markets and morals. From the libertarian perspective, markets respect the right to liberty, while a utilitarian believes that markets promote the society's general welfare. By analyzing the morality of making war-fighting and childbearing available on the market, this chapter aims to further differentiate the theories of justice. What's just? Drafting soldiers or hiring them? During the U.S. Civil War, draft laws were enforced, which allowed draftees to hire someone to take their place. When asked if this system of building an army is just, most Americans would say that it is not, since economic class had a big role in it. However, Sandel points out that it isn't that different from the volunteer system. So, is that unjust as well? To answer that question, the two most common army building methods should be considered: conscription and volunteering. Among these three methods of recruiting soldiers, including the Civil War system, which is the most just? Difficult questions concerning individual freedom and civic duty must be explored in order to answer that. The case for the volunteer army. Utilitarians and libertarians both agree that, when the three army-building methods are ranked from least favorable to most, conscription would be first, followed by the Civil War system, and then volunteering. Still, some disagree with that, as evidenced by the following objections. Objection 1. Fairness and freedom. The first point against the volunteer system concerns the degree of freedom one would actually enjoy in it. Objectors point out that some people have very limited options for making a living and are therefore pressured into joining the military by economic necessity. The coercion and class discrimination within the volunteer system are latent, but very much present. Objection 2. Civic virtue and the common good. This next opposition is based on the premise that military service is a civic obligation, and it is wrong to make that available on the market. Using jury duty as an example, Sandel further explains some of the beliefs of this objection's proponents. One of them is that by not equally sharing this civic responsibility among a nation's people, liberty itself is degraded. Unlike France, America lacks a foreign army. However, that isn't to say that they haven't taken a step in that direction through certain recruitment programs and partnerships with private companies. Pregnancy for pay. The issue of paying women to bear children raises some moral questions. If informed adults signed a contract stating that a woman will be paid to bear the child of an infertile couple, who really deserves to have the newborn? Some would say that despite the deal, the birth mother had the right to keep the child, for she had no idea how hard it would be to give up a baby she carried in her own womb. Others also argue that making childbearing available on the market exploits women and essentially turns children, human lives, into goods that can be bought. Surrogacy, contracts, and justice. The two theories of justice discussed so far both support the enforcement of a surrogacy contract. In the spirit of fairness, the author also considers objections. Objection 1. Tainted consent. This argument rests on the assumption that a free choice made under some kind of pressure, say monetary, is not really free. Objection 2. Degradation and higher goods. The second objection calls out the use of women's reproductive abilities and the selling of babies as degrading acts. This is because different things should be valued in different ways. Where things like houses are valued when they are built and sold, people are valued when they are treated with respect. Those two modes of valuation should not cross over. Arguments have also been made about how surrogacy lowers the value of children by placing them along the lines of commodities that can be bought and sold. Taking this consideration, the author questions which method should be used to determine which values should have higher norms. Studying the issue of paying for pregnancy with these theories can give insights about the toughest questions about morality. Outsourcing pregnancy. In modern times, a different version of surrogacy has been discovered. In vitro fertilization, IVF, made it possible for the birth mother to carry a fertilized egg that shares no genetic data with her, thus lessening the bond that traditional surrogate women feel with the children they carry. Because of gestational surrogacy, commercial surrogacy became even more popular with American couples who can't carry, to the point where they would choose to hire cheaper surrogates from foreign countries. Despite being fundamentally at odds, war fighting and childbearing have one little thing in common. They both raise questions about the degree of freedom actually at work in free markets, and the validity of the claim that certain things have more value than others. What matters is the motive. Immanuel Kant. One's belief in universal human rights can be based on either the greater common good or the principle of self-ownership. A glimpse into the chapter on libertarianism reveals self-possession in a totally uncontrolled manner, such that, when taken to extremes, it can raise additional, more challenging moral dilemmas. This is why there are those, like the famous John Locke, who oppose unfettered rights to self-ownership. Since his ideas are founded in God, which pose religious restrictions, the author points to another theorist for a moral basis of rights. Kant's case for rights. Immanuel Kant authors a different stand on the moral basis of human rights. He rejects both utilitarian and libertarian ideas, saying that human rights are not founded on the idea that they are important, because they benefit the greater good in the long run, or that they honor the fundamental right of self-ownership. Instead, he proposes that human rights must exist simply because humans are rational beings that deserve respect and dignity. Additionally, he tackles the true meaning of freedom. Among the three approaches to justice that the author outlined early on, welfare, freedom, and virtue, Kant is a clear advocate of the second one, and so rejects utilitarianism. The trouble with maximizing happiness. Kant clearly rejects utilitarianism because, for him, it confuses being happy with being good, and morality must be concerned with the latter. Additionally, he feels that the process of calculating certain factors to maximize happiness is inherently faulty, since the concerned factors are subject to change. That does not make sense when the end goal is to arrive at universal human rights. Capabilities for reason and freedom are the main reasons why Kant believes that humans deserve respect and are set apart from other earthly species. Although he partly agrees with Bentham in that humans are sentient beings, he believes that pleasure and pain do not hold the greatest control over them, since reason can also be a controlling agent. What is freedom? Kant's moral philosophy could be easier to grasp if one knows his definition of freedom. He says that when humans are satisfying their desires or avoiding pain, they are not completely acting autonomously. This is because they are driven by a force outside of them that pushes them into making choices or acting a certain way. This take on freedom is further explained by explaining the idea that contrasts autonomy, heteronomy, a Kantian term. A person acting heteronomously is acting because of forces outside of him. True freedom, for Kant, is acting for the sole reason of achieving an end. Nothing else. Only human beings are capable of doing so. Persons and things. Human life is dignified because people have the freedom to do things simply because they want to. They do not need to be instruments to achieve a certain end. This is the most defining difference between human beings and objects. Since Kant places people above objects, it is therefore immoral to treat them as such. Aside from this, other ideas compose Kant's notion of morality. What's moral? Look for the motive. For Kant, an action has moral worth if it's done with good intention, no matter the consequences. This good intention is called the motive of duty. In other words, doing the right thing for the right reason. The calculating shopkeeper and the Better Business Bureau. Certain instances can accent the differences between actions done with the motive of duty and those done with ulterior motives, called motives of inclination. In the case of honesty, people can choose to obey the truth in order to maintain a reputation, make a profit, or claim an incentive, all of which serve self-interests. Therefore, these reasons deprive the act of truth-telling of moral worth. Staying alive. The duty of preserving one's own life showcases the complexity of Kant's notion about which action holds moral worth. Most people enjoy living, and their life-preserving actions are actually motivated by inclinations. However, for a miserable person who chooses to continue living because it would be wrong to do otherwise, the act of preserving life has moral worth. The moral misanthrope. Kant explains that although good deeds done out of compassion are admirable, they still lack moral worth. This is because a person acting out of compassion still takes pleasure from it. Only in a situation where someone, say a misanthrope, gains no pleasure at all out of doing a good deed, but instead does so out of duty, can moral worth be bestowed upon an action. The spelling bee hero. Sandel recounts the story of a boy who told the truth, even though doing so meant that his accomplishment is invalid. The story prompted the author to explain that Kant does not propose that only misanthropic characters can do actions with true moral worth. In fact, Kant recognizes that duty and inclinations often overlap. As long as the right thing is done for the right reason, the pleasure that one gets from it should not undermine its moral worth. What is the supreme principle of morality? In his quest to find out the supreme principle behind morality, Kant connects three major ideas: morality, freedom, and reason. These ideas each have contrasting pairs. For morality, it is duty and inclination. For freedom, autonomy and heteronomy, and for reason, categorical and hypothetical imperatives. Adding to the earlier discussion about freedom's contrasting pair, Sandel explains Kant's belief that people can be truly autonomous if they let practical reason govern their will, instead of pleasures and pains. Kant's concept of reason is widely different than the utilitarians'. Categorical versus hypothetical imperatives. The two ways that reason can command a person's will are the hypothetical and the categorical. The first involves instrumental reason and is conditional. The second is the opposite. An action that is already good in itself makes use of the categorical imperative. Categorical imperative 1. Universalize your maxim. The first version of the categorical imperative states that the principles behind people's actions are moral if and only if they can be applied in all contexts without contradiction. Categorical imperative 2. Treat persons as ends. In another formulation of the categorical imperative, Kant proposes that humanity in itself should be an end or a purpose. People cannot be used to reach some other goal. Morality and freedom. With this, the connection between morality and freedom is made clear. Kant proclaimed that a moral law must have a categorical rather than a hypothetical law, for anyone who is acting according to the latter is not acting freely. Questions for Kant. Since Kant's concepts can be difficult to grasp, the author puts forth and answers some important questions that may have crossed his readers' minds. These questions revolve around topics such as the difference between the categorical imperative and the golden rule, how autonomy can exist if one is fulfilling the duty to do the right thing, the objectivity of moral laws, and the actual existence of free will. Sex, lies, and politics. Kant's case against casual sex. Kant's take on sex outside of marriage is very conservative and traditional. Since he believes that morality is founded on respect and dignity, he considers the act as objectifying for both partners, for they become mere objects needed to satisfy sexual urges. His views on prostitution are very similar. For him, the only situation in which sex is morally acceptable is within a marriage, where the partners consider not just each other's sex, but their entire humanity. Is it wrong to lie to a murderer? Kant's stance against lying is unwavering. He considers the act itself as immoral and should never be done, regardless of the consequences. This is why he believes that lying to a murderer to save one's life is morally wrong. A lot of people disagree with this. Still, Kant's entire philosophy is based on principle, not on consequences. Sandel then offers a kind of defense for Kant's stance through the concept of white lies, or misleading half-truths that use carefully worded phrases in order to avoid both lying and sacrificing individual freedom. Would Kant have defended Bill Clinton? In the case of the former president Bill Clinton's scandal, Mr. Clinton and his company were adamant that he did not lie to the American people when he said that he did not have sexual relations with Monica Lewinsky. He simply misled and deceived them. The difference between the two are important. When a person tells an outright lie, he has no regard whatsoever for the moral law. With deceptive phrases, there exists at least some degree of respect that prompts the speaker to think of a clever way to phrase a statement such that it doesn't seem to be a lie for the listener. This difference is valued even by Kant himself, who in his time has uttered at least one deceptive message. Kant and justice. The political and moral philosophies that Immanuel Kant has crafted through his numerous essays have multiple implications for justice. First, Kant's propositions reject utilitarianism and all its applications to law. Second, he believes that justice and rights are based on a social contract. However, his idea of one is quite eccentric, for he doesn't support the idea of an actual contract, only an imaginary one. A man by the name of John Rawls has since tried to solve this puzzle that Kant left behind. The case for equality. John Rawls. Political philosopher John Rawls had a more refined idea of Kant's imaginary contract. His idea of the contract gives way to two principles of justice: equal basic rights for everyone, and economic and social equality. The moral limits of contracts. Rawls claims that a contract itself is not a moral instrument. It does not validate the terms that it produces. This means that all contracts need a standard of fairness. A debate arises when considering if consent on its own creates obligation. Through such a discussion, one would realize that contracts carry moral weight as long as they reflect autonomy and reciprocity. In actual cases where these two ideals are not properly applied, the moral limits of contracts appear. When consent is not enough. Baseball cards and the leaky toilet. There are cases wherein even though contracts are written up between two consenting parties, a sense of unfairness still remains. Since consent is not enough to create a lasting moral claim, mutual agreement doesn't automatically equal to fairness. Sandel furthers this notion by saying that consent is not necessary for moral obligation, so long as mutual gain is clear. When consent is not essential. Hume's house and the squeegee men. A person who does something for the benefit of another and then afterwards asks for something in return operates on a benefit-based theory of obligation. Those who support this theory believe that consent is not necessary. If someone does something for another on the assumption that he will also benefit from it, the other is morally obligated to comply. Benefit or consent. Sam's Mobile Auto Repair. Another case that exemplifies the confusion that arises from the blurred line between consent-based and benefit-based obligation was from the author's own experience. There are those who believe that a moral obligation is present not on the basis of consent, but rather on the principle of reciprocity. Imagining the perfect contract. These cases of unfairness and confusion come about partly because the parties involved in the contract are differently situated in society, with one having some form of advantage over the other. Rawls' idea of a hypothetical contract removes all that. By imagining people who are writing a contract about society's principles and individual rights behind a veil of ignorance, Rawls proposes the idea of an agreement that ensures equality for everyone. Two principles of justice. Supposing that Rawls' hypothetical idea of a contract can be actualized, Sandel discusses what principles could emerge from it. Utilitarianism would be out of the picture because equal rights and opportunities for everyone would be prioritized over the greater economic and social good. To protect people from debilitating poverty, Rawls puts forth the difference principle. This runs on the idea that some socio-economic inequalities may be allowed in society on the condition that they benefit the most unfortunate citizens. It is concerned with how the basic structure of society allocates duties, income, and opportunities. The argument from moral arbitrariness. The idea underlying the veil of ignorance is the rejection of an arbitrarily based distribution of opportunity and income. One's social status from birth is an arbitrary factor. Even in the free market concept of the libertarian philosophy, there are factors such as educational background that still puts others at a disadvantage. To achieve a more just distribution, Rawls proposes the idea of a fair meritocracy that puts everyone at the same starting line in the race for success. However, even if everyone has equal opportunities in all socio-economic aspects, those who are naturally more talented are still bound to be more successful. The only way to remedy this is to hinder those with special talents. An egalitarian nightmare. Kurt Vonnegut Jr. penned a short story premised on the extreme form of egalitarianism, where no one is better in any way than everyone else. This is not what Rawls had in mind about a morally just society. Through his difference principle, he establishes the notion that certain natural characteristics that could potentially cause inequality, like physical attractiveness and innate intelligence, need not be controlled, as long as the rewards of such qualities can also be reaped by those who do not have them. The society in which they exist is just. Rawls believes that compared to other theories of distribution justice, only the difference principle avoids the basis of arbitrary factors. Objection 1. Incentives. One disadvantage of the difference principle that some people call out is that it is based on incentives. Those who are more gifted are encouraged to exercise their talents through things like higher pay. But what if they choose not to? To this, Rawls answers by clarifying the conditions in which the difference principle can be applied. Objection 2. Effort. The second argument to the difference principle points to the hard work that one puts into honing his talents. If no one owns his natural talents, can't he at least claim the efforts he put into advancing them? Rawls stands by his original claim, explaining that the factors affecting those efforts are circumstantial as well. Aside from that, the author presents another reason why efforts alone can't be rewarded. At the end of the day, what is really rewarded is contribution and achievement, which still relies on abilities and talents that people are just naturally endowed with. Rejecting moral desert. Supposing that Rawls' notions about the moral arbitrariness of talents are right, Sandel brings up the conclusion that distributive justice is not based on rewarding people just because they morally deserve it. Rawls clarifies that this does not mean that no one deserves the fruits of their labor. Rather, he makes a distinction about deserving an end result and being entitled to it by playing by the specific rules. Moral desert is an unworthy basis of distributive justice, at least for Rawls, because while people are entitled to the achievements they gain by using their natural talents and abiding by the rules of the game, they do not deserve the society that rewards the gifts they happen to have. Is life unfair? In showcasing the benefits of a free market economy and criticizing the implications of an egalitarian one, Milton Friedman conceded to the natural unfairness of life, but proposed that instead of trying to remedy it, society should find a way to benefit from it. This is, of course, a claim that Rawls went vehemently against. He believes that the true injustice would lie in letting natural inequalities carry over to the structure and laws of society. Arguing affirmative action. Sandel presents a school's affirmative action admissions policies were challenged. The natural moral question that follows is whether or not affirmative action policies are just. In answering that, arguments for such policies must be discussed. Correcting for the testing gap. One argument for affirmative action policies is that efforts should be made to lessen the testing gap in standardized tests by eliminating racial or socioeconomic class biases. Compensating for past wrongs. The compensatory argument proposes that racial preference should be given to minorities as a way to make up for the history of slavery and segregation in America. One prominent objection to this reasoning is that the people involved in affirmative action policies today are not the same ones who either perpetrated or suffered from discrimination in the past. Promoting diversity. The diversity argument for affirmative action policies states that increasing racial and class diversity within an institution positively benefits the members of that institution as well as the welfare of society in general. Educational establishments which support affirmative action say that it is essentially a civic duty. Objections to the diversity argument are of a practical and principled nature. Do racial preferences violate rights? The principled objection to the diversity argument points out that the rights of people who do not belong to a minority race, a factor that no one can control, are violated. However, students applying to a school have no right to be assessed with different standards than what the school has established. This is due to the fact that at the heart of the diversity argument lies the notion that admission is not a matter of rewarding individual merits. It has no regards for moral desert and uses the school's mission as its basis. Racial segregation and anti-Jewish quotas. Admission policies that have no regard for moral desert have been established by educational institutions in both the early to mid-1900s and the more progressive modern America. The striking difference is that the former used race as a factor in order to satisfy ideals that some ethnicities are superior to others. Meanwhile, affirmative action in school admissions aims to promote diversity for the good of society. Affirmative action for whites? The largest housing project in the U.S. uses a quota system in its admissions process that aims to create a racially balanced community. To achieve that balance, the quota system favored whites. One who supports the diversity argument would not see this situation as an injustice. Once again, since moral desert plays no role in admission standards, no rights have been violated. Can justice be detached from moral desert? It is easier to remove the concept of moral desert from that of justice in theory. However, in reality, justice has an inherent honorific quality that is difficult to ignore, especially by certain institutions that are also partly defined by the goods they promote. Why not auction college admission? Putting aside racial factors, Sandel raises the question of whether or not universities are free to define their missions as they please. If they are, it should be fair to auction off some seats in the classroom to the highest bidder. The discomfort that one could feel about this arrangement comes from an incongruence between the nature and purpose of a commodity, in this case education, and the way it is allocated. Seeing that it is difficult to define the proper foundation of justice and rights without getting into unending debates, the author claims that the modern philosophies discussed so far attempted to accomplish just that without getting into controversy. The next chapters review if they've succeeded. Who deserves what? Aristotle. In a case about a physically disabled cheerleader, the author points out that the essence and purpose of something, such as cheerleading, must first be defined in order to determine the proper way to allocate it. This instance also shows that certain social practices have both an instrumental and honorific purpose. Justice, telos, and honor. Those ideas are reflected in Aristotle's theory of justice. Included in the definition of rights should be the purpose of a social practice. The virtues rewarded by a practice are not too far from its purpose. This goes against other theories of justice that isolate it from virtue. Aristotle also believes a thing should be distributed to someone who is most able to maximize its purpose. This is an example of teleological reasoning. Teleological thinking. Tennis courts and Winnie the Pooh. Teleological reasoning was more popular in the days of Aristotle. This kind of reasoning would support renting a tennis court to professional tennis players instead of, say, unskilled scientists, because doing so would honor the purpose of the tennis court better. Despite being absent in modern science, teleological thinking should not be so immediately dismissed in the study of social institutions and practices. What's the telos of a university? Aristotle's teleological reasoning can be applied in the debate about affirmative action admission policies in universities. In doing so, it follows that the purpose of a university, and therefore its virtues, must be discussed. However, problems arise when there are opposing ideas about what a university must value. What happens in the face of these disagreements? Sandel proposes an Aristotelian answer to that in the following discussion about politics. What's the purpose of politics? Distributive justice for Aristotle is not just the proper allocation of income and opportunities, but also of honors and the right to rule. He agrees that these should be distributed equally, but since he also thinks that all theories of distributive justice discriminate, it should be determined which discriminations are to be considered just. In doing that, teleological reasoning must be used. Predetermining the purpose of any political activity runs the risk of violating individual freedom, but Aristotle disagrees. He says that politics should not just aim for socio-economic prosperity or the welfare of the majority, for there is a higher end, which is the cultivation of a good, virtuous character in every man in society. Therefore, he proposes that people who have the greatest civic virtue are most worthy of political positions. In the honorific aspect, those with civic virtue deserve public recognition. Can you be a good person if you don't participate in politics? Many modern thinkers doubt that politics is essential to living a good life. Aristotle furthers his claim by pointing out that politics is essential for human beings, so that they can realize their unique nature to use language for distinguishing the just from what is not. Politics is the only venue for this because virtues must be learned through embodying them. Learning by doing. A virtuous person becomes one through nothing else but by doing virtuous acts. The law helps with this, for its primary purpose is to promote habits that make a person virtuous. This emphasis on habit does not encourage thoughtless behavior. Instead, Aristotle sees habit as the first step in moral education. What follows is more challenging, discerning which virtuous habit is appropriate in a given context. For that, practical wisdom is needed. Politics and the good life. Aristotle's defense of slavery. This ancient Greek philosopher had questionable beliefs about who could be in the picture of the good life that he had painted. He claimed that slaves and women had no place in politics because their natures were different. Additionally, he justifies the then acceptable practice of slavery through the notions that some people are a natural fit for the role, and that it is a practical necessity. Liberals obviously object and propose that social roles should be allocated by choice and not by fit. Casey Martin's golf cart. There was a case about a professional golfer, Casey Martin, who was at a physiological disadvantage. Upon his request to use golf carts during tournaments, a debate ensued. Other professional golfers who were of sound bodies objected to Martin's request, claiming that it would give him an unfair advantage. Martin counters this by saying that since he already had a physical condition, granting his request would only level the playing field. When taken to court, this debate prompted the use of teleological reasoning. Ultimately, the court ruled in favor of Martin on the premise that the nature of golf would not be significantly affected by the use of a golf cart. The opposition's rage towards the court's decision goes beyond fairness, for also it has something to do with honor. Even though people often try to separate justice and rights from purpose and virtue, it's almost impossible to completely do so. What do we owe one another? Dilemmas of loyalty. Apologies and reparations. Public apologies for the past wrongs committed by nations are also up for debate. Certain countries like Germany and the U.S. have voluntarily apologized, while Japan and Australia are more reluctant to do so. In order to come to a just conclusion about the necessity of such apologies, questions about collective responsibility must be answered. In some cases, public apologies and different kinds of reparations from one community to another can be advantageous. However, by doing so, one also has to take risks, such as reopening old wounds. Should we atone for the sins of our predecessors? One principled argument against making such apologies focuses on responsibility and how one cannot possibly apologize for something that he himself did not do. Numerous persons in political power support his argument. Moral individualism. The aforementioned argument depends on the principle of moral individualism, which states that a person is only responsible for acts which he consensually did. This take on individual freedom, though appealing, leaves little room for concepts such as collective obligation. The author believes that this view of individual freedom is flawed and goes on to review how modern theories of justice define consent. If the idea that every person has an innate freedom and independence holds true, then it follows that society should have a neutral stand on fundamental issues such that it doesn't impose any beliefs on its members. Should government be morally neutral? The idea of a government that supports certain virtues in the name of making the good life available to members of the society is acceptable to more traditional thinkers like Aristotle. Others, like Kant and Rawls, believe that applying such an idea to reality could harm the principles of freedom, even though those principles are, in themselves, moral ideas. They concede to this fact, but also defend their ideas on the basis that they are not forcing anyone to do anything, whereas applications of teleological reasoning somehow do. Justice and freedom. The debate between Rawlsian and Aristotelian ideas is fundamentally a debate between the right and the good. Rawls prioritizes the right because he believes that, as moral agents, people should be free to choose for themselves what ends to pursue without prior moral obligation. Hence, Rawls would say that a government should have a neutral stand towards what virtues a society must have. Modern liberal theories, be they egalitarian or libertarian, would have the same answer as Rawls. However, Sandel believes that their argument is flawed. No matter how enticing the idea, principles of justice cannot be disentangled from conceptions about the good life. He also believes that freedom of choice is not a substantial enough basis for justice. His explanations follow. The claims of community. One aspect of Sandel's argument is that if people value themselves as free individuals that have no moral obligations, certain moral and political responsibilities that people prize in reality, such as solidarity, are forfeited. This realization gave rise to the communitarian critics of modern liberalism. Storytelling beings. In answering the question of how human beings can be free, yet bound to certain social contexts, Alistair MacIntyre brings forth a narrative conception of a person, instead of a voluntarist one. MacIntyre's conception says that an individual can only define his story if he knows the bigger story which he belongs to. In this sense, moral deliberation becomes the act of interpreting one's life story rather than imposing his will. Through proposing the narrative conception, MacIntyre goes against individualism. He believes that it is moral shallowness to assume that people are in no way tied to their past, or the social context they're in. This idea asks if people really are bound by moral ties that they did not agree to. Obligations beyond consent. The liberalist answer is no. Rawls, for instance, would say that people should only feel that it is their moral responsibility to do things out of duty towards their fellow men, or out of voluntary obligation. A supporter of the narrative conception would say that every citizen has a natural obligation that does not require consent. The author presents a third category for obligations, one that is born from the sense of solidarity towards a community with which one shares a history with. Solidarity and belonging. What follows are some common examples of solidarity and membership. Family obligations. Everyone feels responsible for their family members. Parents feel responsible for their children because, in most cases, they chose to have them. This is still true in reverse because most children feel a need to give back to the people who cared for them. French resistance. During the Second World War, a French bomb pilot was given the mission to bomb his home village, which is in line with the mission to free France. Although that mission was just, he could not bring himself to do it because of communal obligation. Rescuing Ethiopian Jews. The Israeli government saved thousands of Ethiopian Jews in 1984. This is an example of a universal duty that all nations and peoples have towards others. Human beings must help, within reason, other human beings in times of need. Is patriotism a virtue? Love of country is the center of another debate. Supporters of this concept, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, claim that patriotism supplements everyone's humanity. While it is true that most countries give and do more for their own citizens than for foreigners, socioeconomic inequalities within a nation challenge the case for national community. Border patrols. A lot of Americans support political efforts to secure the U.S.-Mexico border in order to minimize illegal immigrants. Supporters have various arguments, including one that's communal, another that's for the protection of privilege, and one that concerns the employment opportunities of low-skilled American workers. Is it unfair to buy American? That last argument raises questions about American consumer activity, specifically if American-made goods should be patronized over others. In 2009, the U.S. government showed its support for this reasoning by mandating that all government-funded projects must make use of American-made materials. Objectors reasoned that this might weaken the market for American products outside of the U.S., but did not deny that the intention of the laws made sense. Is solidarity a prejudice for our own kind? Some believe that solidarity is only a front that people use to hide collective selfishness. The author disagrees with this by saying that solidarity can actually create a moral obligation between socially different groups of people and foster a kind of constructive criticism towards one's own people. Both pride and shame are preceded with a sense of responsibility, which wouldn't exist without a feeling of belonging. Can loyalty override universal moral principles? Contrary to popular belief, obligations out of solidarity can actually supplement respect for others' universal rights. Like a libertarian would say, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with one helping his own people, as long as he does not sacrifice other people's rights in doing so. Robert E. Lee. In the case of former Union soldier turned Confederate General Robert Lee, loyalty to his people pushed him into indirectly supporting an unjust cause. Some would concede that Lee's decisions were admirable, since it showed a strong character that acknowledged the context in which he lived his life. Brothers Keeper 1. The Bulger Brothers. The Bulger brothers went on different life paths. One became a political authority, the other a hardened criminal. When the former was asked by the court about the whereabouts of his brother, he claimed to know nothing. This case is an example of how sometimes family loyalty can be prioritized over certain moral obligations. Brothers Keeper 2. The Unabomber. Faced with the same situation, one person decided to make a different call about outing his brother to the authorities. Perhaps this is because, unlike the first case, the man felt that his brother would continue harming others if he did not do something about it. Justice and the Good Life. Sandel believes that the moral obligations highlighted in this chapter do not necessarily need the element of consent, a claim that he strengthened through the narrative conception of the person. He adds that having unchosen moral ties does not violate his concept of freedom. The author then reviews Kantian, Rawlsian, and Aristotelian ideas of freedom, concluding that it is impossible, and at times completely undesirable, to separate debates about politics from individual virtues. Justice and the Common Good. Former American presidents John F. Kennedy and Barack Obama were similar in a lot of ways, but their opinions on the involvement of religion in politics differed significantly. The aspiration to neutrality. Kennedy reflected the notion that governments should be neutral about moral and religious topics so as to not pose a threat to any individual's freedom of choice. Neutrality was practiced economically by Republicans, while liberals believed that it should be extended socio-culturally. Rawls proposed tolerance as the principle behind liberal neutrality, arguing that one's own moral beliefs should not overlap with his political persona, as a sign of respect for everyone's preferences and opinions. This, however, has to be practically applied within reason. The abortion and stem cell debates. Abortion is a topic that has generated numerous heated arguments. Liberals might say that the government should practice neutrality in this aspect, but to base that argument on freedom of choice is inadequate for the author. This is because the question of when personhood begins must first be addressed. The same can be said for stem cell research debates. Same-sex marriage. The debate about the legalization of same-sex marriage honors the notion that virtues cannot be separated from politics. In order to determine if same-sex marriage should be allowed, one should have to conduct teleological reasoning for the concept of marriage. There are 3 ways in which a government can decide on this issue: reserve marriage for heterosexual couples, allow marriage for both heterosexual and homosexual couples, or leave the decision to private institutions. From the standpoint of liberal neutrality, the last option is the most ideal way to go. However, both sides of the debate do not really consider it. Sandel points out that once again, freedom of choice, this time together with non-discrimination, is insufficient ground for those who favor same-sex marriage. Instead, the real issue is based on social recognition. Since marriage is an honorific act, it should first be settled whether same-sex unions are worthy. Justice and the good life. The author finally reveals that among the three ways justice can be defined, he favors the one that involves cultivating virtues in the quest to find the good life. He reasons that maximizing utility and prioritizing individual rights are not enough. As a society, human beings must also be able to collectively find the right way to value certain things. A politics of the common good. With that approach to justice in mind, Sandel proposes a kind of political discourse that has significant considerations of moral topics, in a manner that is also inclusive of civic and economic agendas. 1. Citizenship, sacrifice, and service. A just society must succeed in its mission to inculcate the sense of community in every individual, to the point where everyone would be conscious of the personal virtues that they practice in their public lives. In a vast, democratic society like America, cultivating civic virtue and shared responsibility is a challenge. 2. The moral limits of markets. In some preceding chapters, the idea that making certain things available on the market devalues them arose. Despite the fact that the market is a great avenue for productive activities, a just society should not allow it to dictate its virtues. 3. Inequality, solidarity, and civic virtue. Socioeconomic inequality within a society poses a threat to a citizen's collective moral obligation to his compatriots. With the presence of a virtuous government, this threat may be addressed. 4. A politics of moral engagement. Pluralist societies have gotten accustomed to ignoring the diverse convictions, preferences, and opinions of its citizens. The author believes that this should be remedied through a politics of moral engagement. By participating in such an activity, people would be able to build on a mutual respect of one another, which can be far more advantageous than mere tolerance. In his quest to discover the most ideal principles that must govern politics and morality, Michael Sandel presented 5 main theories of justice in this book. But first, he enumerated the 3 main approaches to justice, which are maximizing utility, protecting freedom, and pursuing the good, virtuous life. The first approach is embodied in utilitarianism, which proposes that a just government and society always aim to maximize pleasure and minimize pain in all their relevant endeavors. This theory puts a premium on the common good. It has 2 major components, Jeremy Bentham and John Mill, meaning that at least 2 versions exist. Libertarianism fundamentally goes against the principles of utilitarianism. Instead of the common good, this theory prioritizes freedom and individual rights, and puts forth the principle of self-ownership as its main argument in most matters. The next theory was proposed by Immanuel Kant. Also a believer of freedom and rights, Kant argues that the right act only has moral worth if the intention behind it is also right. In addition, he came up with the idea of the imaginary contract, which was refined by the next theorist, John Rawls. He believes that the principles which will emerge from a hypothetical contract, agreed upon by people who have a veil of ignorance, truly promote equality. The last theorist is Aristotle. In this particular area, he shares concepts and principles that reflect the virtuous approach to justice. Along with these 5 essential ideas, the author also discussed the morality of certain markets, the cases for and against affirmative action, and the contrasting views on loyalty. Sandel discussed these theories and concepts by consistently considering them from 2 contrasting sides, and by showing how they are applied in both real life and hypothetical situations. He explored questions that not only engage his readers' minds, but also emboldens them to reflect on their own principles and ideals. Every chapter is a testament to Sandel's original goal for this book, which was to attempt to inculcate critical thinking within his readers, so that they may decide for themselves what ideas to support or to respectfully disagree with.